I haven't spoken publicly about this before, something deeply personal that I've kept private until now. I feel it's time to share an unexpected turn in my journey that many might find surprising. Leave a comment saying faith if you want to know why I returned to church after 3 decades away from any religious practice. It wasn't a dramatic conversion experience. There was no crisis that drove me to seek comfort in religion, no voice from above, no miraculous event that suddenly changed my perspective. The truth is much simpler and perhaps more relatable for many of you who've lived long enough to watch your relationship with meaning and purpose evolve over time. I grew up with some religious background. My mother had her own spiritual beliefs, though they weren't tied to regular church attendance. In my teen years, I occasionally attended services more out of social convention than deep conviction. By the time I started building my first companies, organized religion had no place in my life. I was focused on technology, science, and solving concrete problems in the physical world. For 30 years, I didn't set foot in a church, except for the occasional wedding or funeral. My worldview was firmly rooted in physics, engineering, and what could be proven or built. The questions that drove me were about expanding human capabilities, solving energy problems, making life multiplanetary. Big questions, but fundamentally materialistic ones. During those decades, I viewed religious institutions primarily through the lens of their limitations. Dogmatic thinking, resistance to scientific advancement, occasional corruption, or hypocrisy. I saw what they got wrong, not what they might be getting right. Like many technologists, I believed that rationality and innovation would address human needs more effectively than ancient traditions or communal rituals. I wasn't hostile toward religious believers. I just didn't see how those beliefs connected to the tangible problems I was working to solve. If anything, I viewed religion as a relic of an earlier stage of human development that would gradually fade as science and technology advanced. That perspective worked well enough during my 30s and 40s. I was primarily focused on building companies, developing new technologies, addressing global-scale challenges. The questions that occupied me were technical, logistical, organizational. How to make electric vehicles mainstream, how to reduce the cost of space launches, how to transition the world to sustainable energy. But as I entered my 50s, different questions began to surface. It's not replacing the earlier ones, but complementing them. Questions about meaning beyond achievement, about connection beyond professional networks, about what sustains communities through difficult transitions, about what we pass from one generation to the next beyond just technology and wealth. These questions weren't prompted by any crisis or failure. If anything, they emerged during a period of significant success. But that success itself raised deeper questions about what it was all for, about what creates not just progress, but genuine human flourishing. Then something unexpected happened last year. I was driving through a small town early on a Sunday morning while traveling for work. I had a few hours to kill before my next meeting. And as I passed a small, unassuming church, I felt a sudden impulse to stop and go inside. Even now, I can't fully explain that impulse. Curiosity, perhaps, a momentary openness to something different from my usual routine. Whatever it was, I parked my car and walked in just as the service was beginning. I sat in the back row, expecting to feel out of place, like an anthropologist observing an unfamiliar culture. Instead, I found myself unexpectedly moved by the simplicity and sincerity of what I witnessed. The congregation was small, maybe 40 people, mostly older folks with a few young families scattered throughout. Nothing impressive or high-tech, no famous pastor or elaborate music, just ordinary people who had been gathering this way for years, perhaps decades. What struck me first was how intergenerational it was. In our age-segregated society, here was a place where 20-sums sat beside 80-sums, where teenagers helped elderly people to their seats, where young parents passed their babies to grandmotherly figures who welcomed the chance to hold an infant again. This wasn't something I'd consciously noticed was missing from my life. But watching these natural interactions between people of widely different ages, realized how rare this had become in most settings. In my professional world, people tend to cluster in age cohorts.
Even in social settings, we typically spend time with people at similar life stages. Here was a community where age diversity wasn't just tolerated but valued, where the wisdom of elders wasn't dismissed as outdated, where the energy of youth wasn't sequestered, but integrated into the whole. I watched as they greeted one another before the service, not with the networking enthusiasm of a business event or the curated interactions of social media, but with a simple, genuine interest in each other's lives. How's your mother's recovery going? Did your daughter have her baby yet? I heard your son got that job he was hoping for. These weren't superficial exchanges. These people knew each other's stories. They had shared history, shared concerns, shared joys. What struck me was the depth of knowledge they had about each other's lives. They didn't need to catch up on major life events because they were already woven into the fabric of each other's ongoing stories. They remembered what mattered to each other from week to week, month to month, year to year. As I observed, I realized how rare this kind of continuous community has become. In our mobile digital society, we often have to reintroduce ourselves and our concerns each time we connect, even with people we consider friends. Our social circles shift as we move for jobs, as our interests change, as online platforms rise and fall in popularity. The continuity I was witnessing, people who had been showing up for each other consistently over years and even decades, has become increasingly exceptional in contemporary life. As the service progressed, they sang together, not with particular skill, but with an unself-conscious sincerity that's become rare in our performance-oriented culture. The pastor spoke simply about finding strength during difficult times, acknowledging the struggles many were facing without offering simplistic solutions. I was struck by the lack of polish, the absence of production value. This wasn't religion as entertainment or performance. It wasn't optimized for audience engagement or social media sharing. It was something more basic, more human. People creating shared meaning through familiar practices, acknowledging life's difficulties together, drawing strength from collective hope. Then something happened that really caught my attention. They began to share concerns and needs. An elderly man had surgery scheduled. A young couple was struggling financially after job loss. A middle-aged woman's mother had recently moved to a care facility. A teenager was waiting for college acceptance letters. After each concern was shared, the community responded not just with sympathy but with specific offers of help. Meals were arranged for the man recovering from surgery, job leads were mentioned for the young couple. People offered to visit the woman in the care facility to provide companionship. Words of encouragement were directed to the anxious teenager. I sat there watching practical care being organized without spreadsheets, without apps, without organizational hierarchies. Just people who showed up consistently for each other week after week, year after year. What struck me was how different this was from how we typically approach community problems in the technology sector. We tend to build platforms, create organizations, develop systems and algorithms. We scale solutions through technology rather than through consistent human presence. Both approaches have their place, but sitting in that small church, I witnessed something technology alone cannot replicate. The power of showing up in person consistently over time, of knowing others and being known, of carrying each other's burdens not through efficient systems but through sustained relationship. It was beautiful in its simplicity and effectiveness. This wasn't sophisticated or cutting edge. It was ancient humans supporting each other through the challenges of life, offering not just emotional encouragement but practical help. As I drove away off to the service, I felt something I hadn't expected, a sense of longing not for religious doctrine or supernatural explanations but for this kind of consistent intergenerational community, for relationships that weren't transactional or limited to people at exactly my stage of life or in my professional field. I found myself thinking about how segmented my own life had become. I spent time primarily with other entrepreneurs, engineers, investors, people in my professional sphere. My social interactions were largely with peers in similar life circumstances. Even my philanthropic work, while addressing important needs, rarely involved the kind of direct personal engagement I had just witnessed. I found myself thinking about the many brilliant, successful people I know who have no place where they are simply known and supported as human beings rather than for their accomplishments or usefulness. About the hypermobility of modern society that leaves many of us without the lasting bonds these churchgoers clearly shared. I thought about research showing the epidemic of loneliness in our society, affecting people across age groups, but particularly the elderly, about studies demonstrating that meaningful social connection is as important to physical health as exercise or nutrition, about how our digital connections, while valuable, don't fully satisfy our need for in-person community. The following Sunday, I visited another church closer to where I live. It was a different denomination, a different style, but I observed a similar pattern. People who showed up regularly for each other across age differences, across political differences, across socioeconomic differences, united by something they valued above those distinctions. This second visit confirmed that what I'd observed wasn't unique to that particular congregation. It was something inherent to religious communities that had maintained these practices of gathering weekly, of knowing each other's stories, of providing practical care. Over the next few months, I continued this exploration, not driven by theological questions, but by my observation of something profoundly human happening in these communities that has become increasingly rare in our fragmented individualistic society. What I began to understand was that religious communities serve functions that extend far beyond theological belief. They create containers for enduring relationships across differences. They normalize regular gathering and mutual support. They connect generations through shared practices and stories. They provide continuity in an era of constant change. I began to see that while my work has focused on advancing human capabilities through technology, I had overlooked something essential about human thriving. Our deep need for belonging, for meaning that transcends individual achievement, for intergenerational connection, for being part of something that began before us and will continue after us. This realization didn't invalidate the importance of technological innovation or scientific advancement. If anything, it clarified what that innovation is ultimately for. Not just to solve technical problems, but to enable human flourishing in its fullest sense, which includes our social and spiritual dimensions. Technology alone can't meet our need for in-person community, for being known over time, for the wisdom exchange that happens between generations, for the sense of continuity and transcendence that comes from participating in traditions larger than ourselves. This isn't an argument for any specific religious belief. It's an observation about the value of religious communities as human institutions that address needs no app, no technology, and no government program fully meets. What religious communities at their best provide isn't primarily theological, it's relational, it's practical, it's consistent. They create space for the kind of in-person cross-generational relationships that many studies now show are essential for human well-being, but that have become increasingly rare in modern life. I have seen how religious communities often serve as one of the few remaining institutions in society where different generations regularly interact in meaningful ways, where elders aren't segregated but integrated, where children aren't merely entertained but incorporated, where teenagers can form relationships with adults who aren't their parents or teachers, where young adults can receive guidance from those with decades more life experience. In my professional world, we often talk about disrupting traditional institutions, about making older systems obsolete through innovation, and there's value in that approach for many domains. But my church visits help me recognize that some traditional institutions serve functions we haven't fully appreciated or replaced. The Silicon Valley mindset often emphasizes individual freedom, personal optimization, and technological solutions to human problems. These values have driven remarkable progress in many areas, but they've sometimes neglected our equally important needs for stability, community, and meaning beyond individual achievement. 6 months after that first spontaneous visit, I found myself regularly attending a small congregation near my home, not because I've had some dramatic conversion experience, but because I recognized something valuable happening there that I wanted to be part of. I still ask the same scientific questions. I still work on the same technological problems. I still value reason, evidence, and innovation. But I've added another dimension to my understanding of what humans need to thrive, not just as individuals but as communities that span generations. This has influenced my thinking about the companies I lead and the technologies we develop. I find myself asking not just is this innovative, but does this strengthen or weaken human connections? Not just is this efficient, but does this support or undermine community resilience? I've come to believe that the most valuable innovations won't replace human community, but will support and enhance it. They'll make it easier for people to show up for each other consistently, to maintain connections across distances when necessary, to incorporate those who can't be physically present due to illness or mobility challenges. The best technologies won't attempt to substitute for in-person gathering, but will recognize its irreplaceable value while making it more accessible and inclusive. They'll respect the wisdom embedded in traditional practices rather than assuming those practices are merely outdated and ready for disruption. For those of you in your 60s, 70s, and beyond, this might seem obvious. Many of you grew up when community institutions were stronger, when neighborhoods were more stable, when extended families lived near each other. You have witnessed the gradual erosion of these bonds and the increasing isolation that has come with our more mobile digital society. You've experienced firsthand the value of being known over time, of having history with others who remember who you were decades ago, of being part of communities that celebrate and mourn together, that mark life's transitions with shared rituals and practices. What you understand through experience, younger generations often have to discover through painful trial and error that humans need more than individual achievement and material comfort to thrive. We need belonging, we need continuity, we need to be part of something larger than ourselves. Many of you have maintained connections to religious communities throughout your lives. Not necessarily because you agree with every theological position, but because you recognize intuitively what I have come to understand intellectually, that these communities provide something essential that isn't easily replicated elsewhere. Religious communities at their best provide these things not as abstract concepts but as lived realities. They create spaces where the elderly are valued for their wisdom rather than marginalized for their reduced productivity, where children are welcomed as full participants rather than segregated into kid-friendly spaces, where showing up for one another through life's challenges is not an exceptional act but an expected practice. In a society increasingly organized around market value, where worth is often measured by economic productivity, religious communities at their best insist that human value is inherent rather than earned, that the elderly, the ill, the disabled, the very young all have worth that transcends their economic contribution, that showing up for each other is a fundamental human obligation, not just a nice add-on when convenient. My return to church wasn't about finding supernatural answers. It was about recognizing the profound human wisdom embedded in these ancient practices of gathering, of marking life's transitions together, of showing up consistently for one another across differences and across generations. In our rush to innovate, to disrupt, to optimize, we've sometimes discarded practices whose value wasn't immediately obvious from a utilitarian perspective. We've designed for efficiency rather than relationship, for flexibility rather than commitment, for individual choice rather than collective continuity. There's value in innovation and individual freedom, but there's also wisdom in institutions that have sustained human communities through countless social changes, technological revolutions, and historical upheavals. They have maintained the practice of showing up in person regularly over time, of knowing others and being known across years and decades, of supporting each other through life's transitions, not just emotionally but practically, of connecting generations through shared stories, rituals, and values. That's why after 30 years away I returned to church, not with all the theological certainty I once had as a child, but with a deeper appreciation for the human needs these communities address and the social wisdom they embody. My return wasn't about rejecting science or reason. It wasn't about embracing every aspect of religious tradition uncritically. It was about recognizing that human flourishing includes dimensions beyond the technical and material, dimensions of meaning, belonging, continuity, and transcendence that religious communities at their best help to address. I share this not to prescribe this path for everyone, but to suggest that some of our oldest institutions might contain wisdom we still need even as we build new technologies and create new possibilities for the future of humanity. Ancient practices of community don't oppose innovation. They provide the stable human connections that make positive innovation possible and meaningful. They remind us what we're innovating for, not just to extend human capabilities, but to enable human thriving in its fullest sense. That includes our need for meaning beyond ourselves, for connections across generations, for being known and valued, not for what we produce, but simply for who we are. These insights weren't part of my worldview when I focused exclusively on technological solutions to humanity's problems, but they've become an important complement to that work, a reminder of what technology is ultimately for and what it cannot replace. Share this with someone who might appreciate a perspective on faith communities that goes beyond theological debates. Subscribe if you want more reflections on how ancient wisdom and modern innovation might complement each other. What community provides you with intergenerational connections and consistent support?